In a quiet study in Florence, over 5 centuries ago, a man bends over his desk, quill scratching against parchment. His mind is a storm, yet his hand moves with steady purpose. He has seen the rise and fall of leaders, the betrayals of friends, the hunger for power that turns even noble hearts cold. And now, he writes, not for fame, not for flattery, but for truth, the kind of truth that can unsettle kingdoms. This man is Machiavelli, a name that, even today, stirs whispers. To some, he was a political genius. To others, a dangerous schemer. But behind the myths and the shadows is a story, a human story. One of ambition and exile, of dreams and disappointments. Of a thinker who dared to strip away illusions and reveal how power truly works. Tonight, I will take you into his world. We will walk the cobblestone streets of Renaissance Florence. Hear the clink of wine glasses in secret meetings and feel the weight of his lonely nights in exile, where he penned words that would outlive him by centuries. So settle in, let the day's noise fade away, and drift with me into the life, the mind, and the unshakable legacy of Machiavelli. Di Bernardo de Machiavelli was born on May 3, 1469, in Florence, Italy, during a time of intense political turmoil and competing city-states across the Italian peninsula. His family was of modestly distinguished background. His father was an attorney, which granted Machiavelli access to an education steeped in Latin, grammar, and rhetoric, although interestingly he did not learn Greek, a language many humanists of the Renaissance prized. Florence, in Machiavelli's youth, was a hotbed of Renaissance culture, yet dominated by political instability and the fierce rivalry between powerful families such as the Medici, the Sforza, and the Borgias. Machiavelli grew up witnessing firsthand the dramatic shifts of power that swept across his city and beyond. Patterns that would deeply inform his later views on power, governance, and statecraft. At the age of 29, after the Medici family was temporarily expelled from Florence in 1494, Machiavelli began his career in public service, joining the Florentine Republic's second chancery. This role tasked him with the creation of government documents and correspondence, a position that sharpened his writing skills and exposed him to the intricacies of diplomacy and political maneuvering. Over the next 14 years, he would be involved in numerous diplomatic missions to powerful courts across Europe, including France, Spain, and the Papal States, gaining intimate knowledge of political power, struggles, and statecraft. Throughout his diplomatic career, Machiavelli not only observed but also engaged in efforts to strengthen the Florentine Republic. Notably, he played a pivotal role in organizing a citizen militia, which embodied his belief that loyalty and defense should be rooted in the citizens themselves rather than mercenary forces. This military reform was revolutionary in concept, but ultimately fell short in its practical defense of Florence. Machiavelli's encounters with some of the most infamous political figures of the day left a lasting impression. An assignment in 1502 brought him close to Cesare Borgia, the ruthless son of Pope Alexander VI, whose cunning and brutal tactics as a leader both repulsed and fascinated Machiavelli. Borgia's mixture of calculated cruelty, strategic alliances, and opportunistic leadership served as a practical illustration for many of Machiavelli's later writings. Despite his talents and commitment, Machiavelli's fortunes took a dark turn in 1512 when the Medici family returned to power with external support, reinstating their dominion over Florence and ending the Republic. Seen as a loyal servant to the Republican government, Machiavelli was accused of conspiracy against the Medici, leading to his imprisonment and torture. Although eventually released, he was permanently removed from political office and sent into forced retirement at his family estate near Florence. This period of exile marked a profoundly creative yet bitter phase in Machiavelli's life. Barred from public service, he poured his intellect into writing, producing his most influential works, including the famous treatise The Prince 1513, a pragmatic manual on power politics that has resonated through centuries. He also wrote the Discourses on Livy, a broader reflection on republican governance and history, as well as Dell'arte della Guerra, The Art of War, plays like The Mandrake, and historical accounts such as the Florentine histories. In The Prince, Machiavelli introduced his controversial ideas on political leadership, including the notion that rulers must often act immorally to secure and maintain their power, that the ends justify the means, and that it is safer for a ruler to be feared than loved if he cannot be both. He developed the concept of denoting qualities like strength, cunning, and decisiveness necessary for effective rule, balanced against fortuna, the unpredictable forces of chance. Though The Prince was published posthumously and initially banned by the Catholic Church, it cemented Machiavelli's place as a foundational figure in political realism. The study of politics based on practical and empirical observations rather than idealistic or ethical considerations. His insistence on divorcing politics from ethics and religion was groundbreaking, influencing not only the Renaissance but modern political thought worldwide. The latter years of Machiavelli's life remained fraught with political ambiguity. When the Medici were ousted again after the 1527 sack of Rome, the opportunity to reclaim a political role arose but was ultimately denied. Machiavelli died on June 21, 1527, at the age of 58, from a stomach ailment. He was buried in Florence's Church of Santa Croce, where a monument was later commissioned. This first part barely scratches the surface of Machiavelli's complex life and thought, but lays the groundwork for understanding the turbulent world he inhabited, the realpolitik he espoused, and the legacy that would make him one of the most scrutinized and influential thinkers of all time. Machiavelli's political philosophy represents a profound turning point in Western thought, departing sharply from the medieval tradition that had tied politics to religious morality and idealistic visions of governance. His writings laid the foundation for political realism, emphasizing power, pragmatism, and the often harsh necessities facing rulers and states in a chaotic world. At the heart of Machiavelli's thought is the central idea that politics must be observed and conducted based on the way things actually are. Realpolitik, rather than how rulers or philosophers wish them to be. He rejected the notion that political leaders should be bound by conventional ethics or religious principles, if those ideals hampered their ability to secure and maintain political power and the stability of the state. This radical separation of politics from ethics shocked contemporaries and has generated debate for centuries. In The Prince, Machiavelli offers candid advice to rulers on acquiring and holding power, often advocating actions considered ruthless or immoral by traditional Christian and classical standards. He famously argued that a successful ruler sometimes must learn how not to be good, using deceit, manipulation, cruelty, or betrayal, if those tactics serve the interests of the state. The oft-quoted idea that the ends justify the means captures this pragmatic and unsentimental worldview, though Machiavelli never used this exact phrase. Machiavelli's political realism is grounded in his observations of the instability, backstabbing, ambition, and violence that characterized Italian city-states in his lifetime. He saw rulers like Cesare Borgia combine cunning, cruelty, and opportunity to build power effectively, and he used such examples to illustrate the qualities a ruler must possess: decisiveness, adaptability, strength, and willingness to act beyond conventional morality for the greater good of the state. His concept of contrasts with fortuna, or luck, chance, denotes the qualities that enable a prince or leader to shape circumstances, overcome fate, and succeed in the dangerous arena of political life. This includes cunning, decisiveness, boldness, and strategic intelligence, qualities that enable a leader to seize opportunities presented by fortuna, which is inherently unpredictable and uncontrollable. Machiavelli thus emphasized that while luck matters, human agency and skill remain paramount. A key practical recommendation Machiavelli made was that rulers should combine the qualities of both a lion and a fox. The lion represents strength and brute force necessary to confront enemies and impose order. The fox symbolizes cunning and craftiness required to recognize traps and engage in deception when needed. The prince must neither rely solely on force nor on trickery, but masterfully blend both to maintain power. Machiavelli also stressed the importance of a strong and loyal military. Unlike the prevalent reliance on mercenaries, who are motivated primarily by money and often unreliable, he advocated for citizen militias that would be more invested in defending their homeland. He saw the possession of military power as essential for security, independence, and respect on the international stage. For Machiavelli, the art of war was not just a technical discipline, but the foundation of any stable and lasting state. In his broader work, Discourses on Livy, Machiavelli elaborated on republican ideals, arguing for the virtues of popular government and the importance of institutions that encourage citizen participation. He admired the Roman Republic for its resilience and mixed constitution, balancing monarchy consuls, aristocracy senate, and democracy popular assemblies. Though the prince focused on principalities and autocratic governance, the discourses showed Machiavelli's more nuanced views on freedom, liberty, and collective governance. Despite his frank acceptance of cruelty and deception as political tools, Machiavelli was not merely a cynic or nihilist. His works reveal a deep concern for the stability, unity, and prosperity of the state. Above all, the survival of the political community. He believed that political chaos, civil war, and disunity brought ruin and suffering. Hence, a successful ruler might be compelled to act harshly to preserve peace and order, ensuring the long-term welfare of his subjects. Machiavelli severed the divine right of kings and traditional moral constraints from political authority. In his view, the state was not subordinate to the church or religious ethics, but was an autonomous entity, with its own laws and imperatives. He championed the secular state, where political decisions were made based on practical necessity rather than divine sanction or moral purity. This break from the medieval worldview laid crucial groundwork for modern secular political thought. One of Machiavelli's striking ideas was the double standard of morality for rulers and private individuals. The prince, tasked with maintaining power and safeguarding the state, could be excused or even praised for actions that private citizens would condemn as immoral. Honesty, loyalty, or piety might be useful for appearances, but hypocrisy, cunning, and cruelty could be indispensable political tools. This pragmatic realism contrasted sharply with the idealized virtuous ruler imagined in earlier political philosophy. Machiavelli was also acutely aware of human nature's darker sides. He saw people as self-interested, fickle, ungrateful, and easily manipulated. Leaders who believed in people's innate goodness often failed. A prince must assume the worst to guard against betrayal and to maintain control. However, Machiavelli also acknowledged that rulers benefit from the goodwill of their subjects and that being feared, rather than hated, was crucial to holding power. His understanding of leadership extended beyond mere force or fear. Effective rulers needed to cultivate a reputation for strength and moral credibility, or at least the appearance of virtue. Machiavelli recognized that public perception mattered greatly. Therefore, rulers must master both action and image. They should be shrewd actors on the political stage, knowing when to display generosity, piety, or firmness, and when to conceal their true intentions. In sum, Machiavelli's political theory revolves around the ruthless, practical demands of acquiring, maintaining, and exercising power in a turbulent and unpredictable world. His insights into power, dynamics, human motives, and political strategy remain foundational in modern political science, leadership studies, and statcraft. This segment underscores the essence of Machiavelli's philosophy as a pragmatic and realistic doctrine of power, one that divorces governance from idealistic morality and situates the state's survival above all else. His influence can be traced through political thought, diplomacy, military strategy, and even organizational leadership up to the present day. Machiavelli's career in public life, though it lasted less than a decade and a half, was marked by ambitious reforms, bold proposals, and intense diplomatic engagement. His position as second chancellor of the Florentine Republic gave him direct access to the mechanics of governance at one of the most complex and dangerous times in the history of Renaissance Italy. This was a period when Florence's survival depended on skillful maneuvering among much stronger regional powers. The Papal States, the Kingdom of France, the Kingdom of Spain, the Duchy of Milan, and the Republic of Venice, each vying for domination over the fragmented peninsula. One of his most notable achievements was the organization of Florence's citizen militia. At that time, most Italian states relied heavily on mercenaries, known as condottieri, to wage war. Machiavelli saw the inherent Weaknesses in this: mercenaries could be expensive, untrustworthy and disloyal, switching sides if it meant better pay or more favorable terms. In his view, a self-sustaining and independent republic could not rest its security on the whims and greed of hired soldiers. Inspired partly by the Roman Republic's model, he established a local militia recruited from Florentine citizens to provide a more reliable defense force. This was not just a policy change. It was a revolutionary idea for the time. He personally helped supervise training, recruitment, and strategic planning for these forces. The militia system, however, faced significant operational limitations, particularly when tested in open conflict against well-equipped and professional armies. Though not a sweeping military success in practice, the initiative revealed Machiavelli's broader belief in civic responsibility, discipline, and the direct involvement of citizens in a republic's defense. Diplomatically, Machiavelli's missions were both an education and an arena for achievement. Between 1499 and 1512, he undertook scores of diplomatic trips. He negotiated with King Louis XII of France, observed the court of Ferdinand of Aragon in Spain, and engaged with the formidable papal court during the reigns of Pope Julius II and Pope Alexander VI, his most famous and perhaps most formative mission was in 1502 to 1503 to observe the campaigns of Cesare Borgia. Cesare Borgia's political and military exploits were a master class in aggressive statecraft. The son of a pope, Borgia carved out a principality in central Italy through a mixture of calculated brutality, opportunistic alliances, and swift military action. Machiavelli admired, not morally, but technically, how Borgia consolidated power, neutralized rivals, and exploited both fear and loyalty to hold together a fragile domain. Observing Borgia's strategies gave Machiavelli living examples of many of the principles he would later articulate in The Prince: the need to act decisively, the utility of controlled cruelty, the advantage of outsmarting opponents who rely on predictable patterns, and the value of appearing both merciful and fearsome when circumstances demand. Within Florence itself, Machiavelli's influence extended to internal reforms. He advocated for greater efficiency and transparency in government administration, worked on foreign policy strategies, and contributed to the planning of public projects. He was not without opponents at home. Florentine politics were notoriously factional. His association with the Republican government inevitably positioned him against Medici sympathizers, which would later be among the reasons for his downfall. That downfall came swiftly in 1512, when the Medici family returned to power with Spanish support. The Republican government collapsed. Machiavelli was summarily dismissed, and shortly thereafter, he was accused of conspiring in a plot to overthrow the new regime, imprisoned and subjected to the strappado, a torture in which the prisoner was hung by the arms bound behind his back. Machiavelli endured intense physical pain and uncertainty about his fate. Although there was no conclusive evidence against him, the accusations were politically convenient for the Medici, and his release was conditional upon his permanent removal from public office. Exile proved both a personal catastrophe and an intellectual turning point. Denied access to the world of politics that had been the center of his life, Machiavelli retreated to his small estate at Sant'Andrea in Percusina. There, he turned his energies to writing, in part as a way of staying relevant to political life from which he was physically barred. He corresponded with friends still in service, offered unsolicited political advice to the Medici, and poured his observations into works that would secure his posthumous fame. His first major work after his dismissal was The Prince 1513, written ostensibly to gain favor with Lorenzo de' Medici, the new head of the family. Far from being a mere instruction manual for tyranny, the treatise was a tightly argued analysis of power dynamics, informed by history and Machiavelli's own experiences. It shocked many when it circulated in manuscript and, in later years, when it was printed. The frankness with which it addressed deceit, the advantage of fear over love, and the manipulation of public perception ran counter to humanist ideals of virtuous rule that dominated Renaissance political theory. The reaction during Machiavelli's lifetime was mixed. Among some circles, the prince was admired for its clarity, intelligence, and unflinching honesty about the realities of politics. Among others, especially the Church, it was condemned as immoral. The Catholic Church would later place the work on its index of prohibited books. This condemnation would give Machiavelli a reputation for endorsing unscrupulous ruthlessness, a sentiment that survives in the adjective Machiavellian. Simultaneously, Machiavelli was working on the Discourses on Livy, a sprawling, more theoretical work that championed the virtues of republican governance. This text was essentially the philosophical counterweight to the Prince. In the Discourses, he argued that liberty, civic virtue, and the active participation of the citizenry were the foundations of a strong and stable state. This duality, author of both an unapologetic manual for monarchical power and a passionate defense of republicanism, is central to Machiavelli's intellectual complexity and part of why interpreting his legacy is such a challenge. Other works demonstrated his versatility. The Art of War addressed military organization and strategy. His comedic play, The Mandrake, satirized society and remains a staple of Renaissance literature. And his Florentine histories, commissioned by the Medici, provided an expansive, if politically delicate, account of the city's past. Each work, in its own way, reflected his preoccupation with the tension between human ambition and political necessity. Despite his efforts to reconcile with the Medici, penning dedications, offering counsel, even serving in minor advisory roles, Machiavelli never returned to the high governmental office he once held. His frustration at this exclusion is evident in his letters, in which he alternates between humor, resignation, and guarded hope for reinstatement. In the final year of his life, the political wheel turned again in 1527. The Medici were expelled from Florence in the chaos following the sack of Rome. For a brief moment, a republican government was restored, and there was talk of giving Machiavelli an advisory role, but suspicion lingered. Some Republicans distrusted him because of his recent service to the Medici, while Medici supporters viewed him as a lifelong enemy. He died that same year, possibly from illness brought on by distress, without seeing his beloved city achieve the republican stability he long envisioned. It would be in the years and centuries after his death that his reputation would crystallize and polarize. For critics, he was the prophet of deceit, the teacher of tyrants, the amoral schemer who placed power above goodness. For admirers, he was a fearless truth-teller, willing to strip away comforting illusions in order to speak plainly about the brutal mechanics of politics. Scholars have argued that his supposed cynicism was, in reality, a form of hard-headed patriotism, that Machiavelli cared less about moralizing and more about saving states from destruction in an unforgiving world. His name entered the lexicon as Machiavellian, originally as an insult implying treachery, cunning, and unscrupulous manipulation. Yet, in modern contexts, Machiavellian is sometimes used with a measure of respect, denoting strategic foresight, adaptability, and shrewdness in competitive environments ranging from politics to business. The endurance of his works is testament to his insight into human behavior and institutional power. Leaders as diverse as Frederick the Great, Napoleon Bonaparte, Benjamin Franklin, and modern political strategists have read and reflected upon the Prince and the discourses. The notion that politics is an autonomous realm, governed by its own logic rather than by the moral codes that apply to private life, remains a central, if controversial, pillar of political science. By the end of his life, Machiavelli had produced a body of work that was more influential than his official political career ever was in its own time. His achievements: military reform, diplomatic negotiation, the authorship of some of the most seminal political treatises in Western history, stand in sharp contrast to the humiliations he endured: imprisonment, torture, exile, the denial of high office, and the enduring moral controversy over his ideas. And yet, it is precisely that blend of triumph and challenge that forged the legend. A man grounded in the messiness of actual politics, who understood both the nobility and the treachery that humans are capable of. Machiavelli emerged as a thinker whose relevance is undiminished half a millennium later. His life is a reminder that the pursuit of political wisdom can be costly, that telling uncomfortable truths may bring exile rather than reward, yet may also secure immortality. When Machiavelli died in 1527, his work was known to a small circle of Florentine elites and fellow statesmen. But the broader European world would only begin to wrestle with his ideas in the decades after his passing. The political upheavals of the 16th century, wars of religion, the Habsburg-Valois rivalry, the rise of nation-states created fertile ground for the dissemination and controversy of his writings. Almost from the moment the Prince began to circulate more widely, it ignited a firestorm of reaction that would shape the Machiavellian image for centuries. The first stage of this legacy was marked by moral shock. The stark pragmatism of the Prince, its counsel to prefer being feared to being loved, to simulate virtues while being ready to abandon them, to use cruelty judiciously for the security of the state, seemed, to many readers steeped in Christian and humanist traditions, a kind of handbook for sin. Its divergence from the moral philosophy of classical thinkers like Cicero, who valued justice and benevolence in leadership, was jarring. To clergy and moralists, Machiavelli appeared to present a naked power politics, stripped of divine or ethical constraints. The Catholic Church's reaction was decisive in 1559. Nearly 3 decades after his death, Pope Paul IV placed all of Machiavelli's works, regardless of content, on the Index Librorum Prohibitorum, the list of prohibited books. This wholesale condemnation made no distinction between the prince and his republican leaning. Discourses on Livy, such a sweeping ban, ironically increased his notoriety across Europe. Protestant states, eager to portray Catholicism as corrupt and tyrannical, sometimes used Machiavelli's name to describe papal statecraft, as if the Vatican itself had been guided by his devilish manual. By the late 16th and early 17th centuries, Machiavellian was firmly entrenched in the European lexicon, carrying sinister connotations. In Elizabethan England, for instance, the stage Machiavel became a stock villain in theatre, cunning, amoral, and hungry for power. Playwrights like Christopher Marlowe, in works such as The Jew of Malta, exploited the image of a shadowy Machiavel as a symbol of cold political scheming. William Shakespeare, while subtler, sprinkled allusions throughout his plays, with characters like Richard III and Iago in Othello echoing the kind of manipulative strategies readers associated with Machiavelli's pages. This period cemented much of the public misunderstanding of Machiavelli. Most readers had not engaged deeply with his entire corpus, and fewer still appreciated the context of early 16th century Italian politics, in which instability, factionalism, and foreign intervention were constant threats. The subtler republican ideals of the discourses were largely overlooked in favor of the more scandalous prince, and the label Machiavellian became shorthand for unprincipled cunning. Yet, even as his name was being used as a curse, there were thinkers who read him closely and took him seriously as a theorist of statecraft. Figures like Francis Bacon in England and later Cardinal Richelieu in France saw in Machiavelli's work not an endorsement of evil for its own sake, but a candid recognition of the realities of power, realities that might be managed wisely, if not always morally. To such readers, dismissing Machiavelli as a corrupter of morals was a way of ignoring the uncomfortable truths about politics. In the 17th century, the political philosopher Thomas Hobbes, though very different in scope and method, shared with Machiavelli the premise that human nature was inclined toward self-interest and conflict. Hobbes, too, insisted that political order required a clear-eyed understanding of these traits. While Hobbes did not explicitly embrace Machiavelli's more flexible morality for rulers, he contributed to gradually shifting the study of politics toward empirical realism rather than moral idealism. The Enlightenment of the 18th century brought a more critical rehabilitation of Machiavelli. The rediscovery and wider reading of the discourses on Livy revealed to many philosophes that Machiavelli was not simply an advisor to despots, but also a keen admirer of republican government. Montesquieu, in the spirit of the laws, drew heavily on Machiavelli's Roman examples. Jean-Jacques Rousseau went further, declaring that while Machiavelli seemed to give lessons to kings, the Prince was in fact written for the people, to show them the nature of tyranny and how to resist it. This interpretation swung the pendulum in Rousseau's hands. Machiavelli was transformed into a secret republican whose true intent was liberation, not oppression. The late 18th and 19th centuries further diversified his reputation. The revolutionary movements in America and France looked to Republican Rome often through the same historical lens Machiavelli had employed in the discourses. In a paradoxical twist, an author long. Damned for Amorality was claimed by revolutionaries as a champion of civic freedom and citizen armies. Napoleon Bonaparte read The Prince and admired its strategic insights. His authoritarian rivals denounced him as Machiavellian in the pejorative sense, underscoring the dual use of the label as both praise and insult. In Italy itself, during the Risorgimento, the movement for unification in the 19th century, Machiavelli was reclaimed as a patriot who had envisioned a strong, unified Italian state. Giuseppe Mazzini, the Republican revolutionary, praised aspects of his Republican vision, while others cited his pragmatic realism as justification for the delicate diplomacy and strategic compromises needed to forge unity from fragmented principalities. Throughout these centuries, the bifurcated image persisted. On one side, the old Nick of politics, a tutor in corruption. On the other, the clear-eyed patriot and analyst of civic virtue. This divide was mirrored in academic treatments. Historians and political theorists debated whether The Prince should be read straightforwardly as advice to autocrats, ironically as a coded Republican tract, or as an amoral but neutral handbook on political mechanics. By the 20th century, Machiavelli's reach extended well beyond the academy. Political leaders from vastly different systems, liberal democracies, fascist regimes, communist states, found in his writings tools for leadership, whether or not they acknowledged them publicly. Benito Mussolini claimed to admire Machiavelli as an Italian nationalist before twisting his image to fit fascist ideology. By contrast, Franklin D. Roosevelt reportedly kept a copy of The Prince and valued its reminders about timing, perception, and decisive action. World War II and its aftermath, with its mix of ideological conflict and realpolitik diplomacy, revived interest in Machiavelli's balance of and fortuna. His separation of politics from morality resonated in a world where alliances shifted rapidly and moral compromises were routine. In the Cold War, both Western and Soviet analysts dissected his maxims for clues on how to manage rivalries, manipulate appearances, and navigate crises. Meanwhile, Machiavelli's presence in popular culture grew ever stronger. Political handbooks, corporate management guides, and even sports coaching manuals borrowed his name and cherry-picked his aphorisms. Sometimes this amounted to little more than sensational misuse, reinforcing the popular caricature of Machiavelli as the patron saint of deception. But it also attests to his pervasiveness as a symbol of strategic cunning. Scholars in the latter half of the 20th century sought to place him more firmly back in his Renaissance context. Intellectual historians emphasized the specific conditions of Florentine politics, the chaos of the Italian wars, and the humanist education that shaped his historical references. They highlighted the tragedy of a man committed to political service who, barred from office, tried to think through the hard questions of leadership from a position of frustrated exile. This contextual approach softened some condemnations without erasing the harder edges of his thought. Reading Machiavelli in full, The Prince alongside the discourses, The Art of War, and his plays and letters, reveals a thinker concerned not just with power's acquisition, but with its use for the endurance of the state, and, in republics, for the active liberty of citizens. Even his advice to princes, while sometimes brutal, often carries the subtext that stability and public order are the ultimate aims. In the 21st century, Machiavelli retains an unparalleled place in the discourse about leadership and governance. His work remains canonical in political science curricula, debated in business schools, quoted in journalism, and appropriated in popular media. Modern democracies grapple with the same questions he posed. How much compromise is too much? Should leaders always tell the truth, or sometimes conceal it for the greater good? Is it possible to reconcile moral ideals with the demands of effective governance? In this way, his writings are not relics of the Renaissance, but living provocations. The legend of Machiavelli, crafted from fear, admiration, distortion, and rediscovery, offers at least two enduring takeaways. First, that honest analysis of political life will almost always offend those who prefer comforting ideals to unsettling truths. Second, that the measure of a thinker is not only in the prescriptions they make, but in the debates they inspire across generations. Machiavelli's ideas, whether one views them as dangerous immorality or necessary realism, continue to force readers to confront the gap between the world as we wish it to be and the world as it is, to truly grasp Machiavelli's enduring influence. It is necessary to go beyond his biography and the historical reception of his books, and immerse ourselves in the core architecture of his thought, the conceptual pillars he returned to again and again. Whether writing The Prince, the discourses on Livy, or his other political and historical works, these are not abstract ideals removed from reality. They are concepts carved directly from the hard stone of political experience, quarried during years of diplomacy, observation, and personal trial. At the center stands his much-discussed concept of. Modern readers risk misunderstanding this word if they mistake it for the English virtue in its purely moral sense. For Machiavelli was a blend of qualities: strength, decisiveness, boldness, strategic insight, adaptability that allowed a leader to shape events rather than be shaped by them. It was neither inherently moral nor immoral. It was a kind of political and strategic excellence. A person could seize opportunities, impose their will on circumstances, and navigate crises with skill and courage. In a way, was about self-mastery and mastery of one's environment, where hesitation or weakness could spell disaster. Paired within Machiavelli's thinking is fortuna. Fortune, luck, chance, the unpredictable currents of life and politics. He often personified Fortuna as a capricious woman who favored boldness, who must be beaten or mastered if one were to thrive. This image, striking to modern sensibilities, reveals something more than Renaissance gender conventions. It encapsulates his belief that although luck plays a role in success, those who prepare themselves and act boldly can control a greater share of their destiny. Yet, he never suggested that Fortuna could be banished. It was always present, able to overturn even the most careful plans. The wise ruler's task was to anticipate its shifts and be ready to change course when it turned. This adaptability leads to one of Machiavelli's most famous metaphors, the need for a ruler to be both a lion and a fox. The lion represents open strength, force, and intimidation, the ability to fend off wolves, resist threats, and establish authority. The fox represents cunning and the ability to detect traps before they spring. A leader relying solely on brute force will be deceived. One relying only on cleverness will be overpowered. The art of leadership, for Machiavelli, lies in knowing when to bare teeth and when to weave the subtle nets of strategy. Underpinning all of this is his unsentimental view of human nature. He argued repeatedly that people are, by and large, self-interested, fickle, and short-sighted. They can be generous and loyal, but often only when it suits their advantage. And they can turn on a ruler quickly if their own interests seem threatened. If leaders build policy on the assumption of moral constancy or gratitude, they invited disaster. This was not to say that public goodwill is worthless. It is indeed valuable, but fragile. Thus, when he advised that it is safer to be feared than loved, if you cannot be both, it was not a celebration of cruelty for its own sake, but a recognition that fear is a more dependable bond in unstable political climates. Fear, when carefully managed to avoid hatred, creates a buffer against sudden betrayal. One of the strikingly modern aspects of Machiavelli's philosophy is his understanding of appearances versus reality. He insisted that rulers must appear to embody virtues that citizens admire: mercy, faith, integrity, humanity, and religion, but must also be prepared internally to act contrary to those virtues when necessity demands it. The public face and the private calculation are not the same, and good leadership requires a mastery of political theatre. This insight anticipated the media-driven politics of later centuries, where image management can determine political survival as much as actual policy. Nowhere is the fusion of fortuna and image management more evident than in his treatment of military power. Machiavelli was unwavering in his belief that armed force under one's own control. Ideally, a citizen militia was the bedrock of any real independence. Relying on mercenaries or auxiliary troops provided by allied states was courting ruin. They were loyal to pay or to their own leaders, not to the cause of the state they served. Furthermore, a populace accustomed to arms would not only defend its homeland, but also cultivate the discipline and civic spirit that sustain a republic. Here, Machiavelli's advice to princes and republics converged. Without military preparedness, all other virtues are meaningless when external threats arise. Interestingly, his art of war expands this military vision into a blend of technical advice on formations, weapons, training, and philosophical reflection on the role of military power in shaping civic life. A community's military structure reflects and reinforces its political structure. A corrupt or complacent state will have a weak army. A strong, virtuous citizenry will produce a strong and effective one. Thus, for Machiavelli, military and political reform went hand in hand. His emphasis on pragmatism also extended to lawmaking and institution building. In the Discourses, he analyzed how Rome balanced monarchy, aristocracy, and democracy to avoid the corruption each form could bring if unchecked. He argued that mixed governments, with overlapping institutions and checks, produced more stability, because ambition and faction were channeled into competition that strengthened the state rather than tearing it apart. This cyclical view of political life, that states naturally pass through stages of rise, corruption, and renewal, underscored his belief that constant maintenance was required to preserve liberty. It is easy to see how these ideas have outlived the Renaissance context. The Fortuna dynamic plays out not only in geopolitics, but also in business strategy, crisis management, and personal leadership. The lion and fox balance reads like advice for negotiation as readily as for military command. The awareness that public image must sometimes diverge from private strategy mirrors the realities of branding and communications in the modern age. At the same time, Machiavelli's counsel is not limitless license for deceit and force. He warned that cruelty, if used, must be well judged and executed swiftly, followed by measures that secure the goodwill or at least the acquiescence of the populace. Excessive or needless cruelty breeds hatred, which he considered more dangerous than being merely unloved. Similarly, deception that is uncovered loses its utility and can destroy credibility irreparably. He understood politics as a long game in which today's expedient choice must still allow for tomorrow's stability. One of his most enduring lessons is the call for leaders to read the times, what he called tempo. Actions that succeed in one set of circumstances may fail in another. Lies partly in matching one's style and strategy to the moment. A cautious, calculated leader may prosper in calm periods but fail in crisis. A bold risk-taker may thrive in disruption yet founder in peace. The ability to shift modes, to sense when fortuna demands aggression and when it demands restraint, distinguishes the merely competent ruler from the great one. Even in the prince, often labeled as amoral, there is a thread of responsibility, the ruler's license to act beyond conventional morality is always tied to the preservation of the state. The state itself, its security, stability, and capacity to govern is the moral horizon within which Machiavelli operates. To let the state fall is the greatest political sin, because it plunges the citizens into chaos, violence, and domination by outsiders. For those outside political office, Machiavelli's categories offer tools for understanding power in any sphere, the balance of skill and chance in success, the necessity of both strength and subtlety, the gap between image and action, the risks of over-reliance on external props, and the primacy of preparation. They also force an uncomfortable but essential question. Are we prepared to accept the moral compromises that effective leadership sometimes demands? Or do we prefer leaders who cling to ideals even at the cost of losing the capacity to protect and guide their communities? In that way, Machiavelli's core concepts remain as much moral provocations as strategic frameworks. They do not command agreement. They invite reflection, even resistance. But they strip away the illusion that power is ever exercised in a morally frictionless world. When Machiavelli sharpened his quill in the quiet exile of his Sant'Andrea estate to pen the Prince and later the Discourses, he could hardly have foreseen the range of figures and causes that would eventually brandish his ideas, whether consciously citing him or reinventing his principles under different names. And yet, history after Machiavelli reads almost like a living laboratory in which his principles are tested, confirmed, or challenged by events and leaders long after the dust of Florence's political intrigues had settled over his grave. In politics, One of the most conspicuous early appropriators of Machiavellian thought was Cardinal Richelieu, the 17th century architect of French royal power under Louis XIII. Richelieu was not merely a courtier but a strategist who reinforced the monarchy by weakening feudal nobles, controlling the Huguenots, and navigating a Europe racked by the 30 Years' War. His balancing acts: diplomacy when possible, force when necessary, echoed Machiavelli's counsel on mixing the fox's cunning with the lion's strength. Though not universally loved, Richelieu understood Machiavelli's insight that fear can be a safer foundation than affection, so long as it stops short of hatred. In the revolutionary era, Napoleon Bonaparte became an almost textbook embodiment of rising from an obscure Corsican artillery officer to emperor of France. Napoleon seized fortune as opportunities through military genius, relentless energy, and psychological mastery over both troops and political opponents. He read The Prince, admired its concentration on decisive action, and implemented many of its lessons, controlling image through symbols and ceremonies, rewarding loyalty with advancement, using fear and respect to inspire obedience, and moving swiftly to neutralize rival coalitions before they could unite against him. Yet, in the end, when fortuna turned, as in the ill-fated Russian campaign, even Napoleons could not wholly overcome the brutal turns of chance, illustrating Machiavelli's caution that fortune can never be permanently subdued. In the modern age, Winston Churchill's wartime leadership bore certain Machiavellian hallmarks, even if his moral rhetoric stood in contrast to the Florentines' pragmatic tone. Churchill's public persona, bulldog, defiance, eloquent appeals to unity, masked behind-the-scenes compromises, strategic misdirections, and calculated alliances with morally dubious partners such as Stalin's Soviet Union to achieve the primary aim, survival of Britain and ultimate victory over Nazi Germany. This is very much in line with Machiavelli's principle that the overriding duty of a leader is to preserve the state, adapting means to the severity of the threat. Across the Atlantic, Franklin D. Roosevelt employed his own brand of Machiavellian artistry in domestic and foreign policy. The New Deal coalition required managing conflicting interest groups: labor, business, farmers, Southern segregationists, Northern liberals. FDR projected warmth and optimism, yet was perfectly capable of political hardball, maneuvering opponents, using patronage, and keeping rivals guessing. In foreign policy, his gradual edging of the United States toward aiding the Allies before openly entering World War II reflected the fox's subtlety, sensing when fortuna was beginning to shift and preparing the nation for a decisive role. The 20th century also saw authoritarian leaders, from Mussolini to Stalin, explicitly claim Machiavelli's mantle, though often as propaganda. Mussolini, in particular, liked to frame himself as the heir to Italian political realism, presenting himself as the man of who could finally unify and empower Italy. Stalin, though operating in a communist framework, frequently applied harsh decisiveness reminiscent of Cesare Borgia's example, eliminating rivals quickly and absolutely, controlling the perception of his role, and subordinating moral norms to the imperative of state consolidation. In both cases, the selective appropriation of Machiavelli's ideas served to justify authoritarian dominance, even if stripped of his Republican sympathies. Outside the strict realm of politics, Machiavelli's principles have migrated into the world of business strategy and leadership training. Modern executives often talk of competitive advantage, market positioning, and strategic pivots in a way that resonates with Machiavelli's notion of adapting to the times and seizing fortuna. Corporate leaders who manage public image skillfully while making ruthless internal restructurings, all framed as necessary for the firm's survival, are walking a line he described, appearing benevolent while executing hard decisions behind closed doors. Consider, for example, Steve Jobs at Apple. Jobs cultivated an image of visionary simplicity and elegance in design, the appearance of virtue, while internally demanding exacting standards, reshaping teams rapidly, and making calculated strategic gambles decisive in action. Like Machiavelli's ideal ruler, he understood that controlling perception is as critical as having the technical or organizational substance to back it up. Social movements, too, have sometimes drawn, consciously or unconsciously, from Machiavellian insight. Leaders of liberation struggles often balance the lion's courage in open confrontation with the fox's discretion in building alliances, framing messages, and timing actions. Nelson Mandela's transition from imprisoned revolutionary to president of a democratic South Africa involved deft signaling, showing strength to the apartheid regime while signaling moderation to potential white allies, and presenting an image of reconciliatory virtue to a wary international community. This calibrated blend of firmness and flexibility is pure Machiavellian craftsmanship, though directed toward profoundly different moral ends than those of a conquering prince. Even nonviolent strategists like Mahatma Gandhi used tactics that can be read through a Machiavellian lens, not in moral content, but in strategic execution. Gandhi's public image was one of moral purity and asceticism, yet behind this was meticulous planning, reading the adversary's strengths and weaknesses, and timing campaigns to maximize pressure while minimizing the risks of uncontrolled escalation. Though Gandhi explicitly rejected violence, he nonetheless demonstrated the insight that perception management and carefully staged actions can shift the balance of power, a principle Machiavelli recognized across all forms of conflict. Machiavelli's observations about the dangers of mercenary forces and the importance of direct control over armed might also echo in modern geopolitics. States that rely heavily on external power for their defense, whether through private security contractors or dominant alliances, risk finding themselves at the mercy of those same forces. The US debates on the use of military contractors in Iraq and Afghanistan, or the European Union's dependence on NATO's US backbone, carry distant reverberations of his warnings about condottieri. Importantly, Machiavelli's admonitions on adapting to the tempo of the times remain acutely relevant. Political and business history is littered with leaders who failed not because they lacked talent, but because they clung to strategies suited to a past that no longer existed. Kodak's collapse in the face of digital photography, Blockbuster's refusal to pivot against streaming, or political parties unwilling to update their platforms amid changing demographics, all can be read as failures of to match the era's shifting fortuna. In the sphere of diplomacy, statesmen like Henry Kissinger in the Cold War era openly embraced a realist approach akin to Machiavelli's, prioritizing balance of power politics. Negotiating deals with distasteful regimes to prevent greater instability, and carefully controlling the optics of international engagement. Kissinger's shuttle diplomacy in the Middle East or the opening to China under Nixon bore the marks of timing, adaptability, and the sometimes uncomfortable separation of moral preference from strategic necessity. What unites all these examples, whether from democratic reformers, authoritarian rulers, CEOs, or revolutionary leaders, is the pragmatic core, the recognition that leadership in any competitive arena involves a constant dance between strength and subtlety, moral aspiration and hard-headed assessment, seizing opportunities and mitigating risks. Machiavelli's framework has proven elastic enough to be wielded for aims he might have approved and others he surely would have abhorred. That elasticity itself is a testament to the penetrating realism of his analysis. Machiavelli's endurance in practical application rests on a paradox. His prescription for political survival often requires what he called learning how not to be good, but it also demands an unyielding commitment to a higher good, the preservation and strengthening of the political community. Stripped of its Renaissance trappings, his advice can be as relevant to a local mayor navigating fractious councils as to a multinational CEO bracing for market disruption or a resistance leader plotting liberation. The question that remains for each era is how far to take his counsel. Is it enough to borrow the agility of mind and shrewdness of perception that he advocated? Or does success in harsh arenas inexorably push leaders toward the moral compromises he warned might be necessary? This tension between the moral and the Machiavellian is what keeps his writings alive, not as a settled doctrine, but as a continual challenge to those who would lead. It is tempting, when reading The Prince or the Discourses, to imagine Machiavelli as a stern and calculating presence, all sharp angles, caution, and cold insight. Yet, the historical was far more than the severe political realist immortalized in popular myth. In his letters, plays, jokes, and personal relationships, we meet a different man, quick-witted, occasionally mischievous, sensitive to beauty, and deeply human in his frustrations and pleasures. Machiavelli's exile life at his Sant'Andrea estate after 1512 offers some of the richest glimpses of this private dimension. In one famously candid letter to his friend Francesco Vettori, Machiavelli described his daily routine with almost comic self-awareness. By day, he tended to his small property, dealt with cranky laborers, and played dice and cards with local innkeepers, activities he admitted were hardly grand. Then, in the evenings, he would wash off the dust and put on clothes suitable for a meeting of state, retreating to his study to enter the ancient courts of ancient men. There, through reading Livy, Tacitus, Plutarch, and others, he engaged in conversations across the centuries. In these quiet hours, he wrote not for immediate gain, but to keep his intellect alive. His humor was one of his defining traits among friends. Very different from the austere strategist image, he enjoyed ribald stories, clever wordplay, and playful satire. These qualities spill into his literary works outside politics, especially La Mandragola, the Mandrake, a biting comedy about manipulation, deception, and desire. while ostensibly a farce, brimming with absurd situations and bawdy exchanges. The play also mirrors his political thinking. Human beings are endlessly inventive when pursuing what they want, and appearances can mask the true currents of action. The play's success in Florence, even under Medici eyes, speaks to his deftness in cloaking sharp social commentary with humor. Machiavelli's writing also reveals affection for certain friends and intellects. His correspondence with Vettori is notable for its mix of political analysis, personal gossip, philosophical musing, and earthy anecdotes. He could be self-deprecating, calling himself idle, or a loafer in exile. Yet the wit beneath it shows a man unwilling to surrender his spirit to circumstance. He was an acute observer of the theatre of life, not just the political variety. Accounts from acquaintances suggest he had a taste for tavern conversations, songs, and performances, blending seamlessly with tradesmen and farmers despite his patrician education. This sociability may have contributed to the grounded realism of his work. He did not theorize about the people from an ivory tower. He drank and laughed with them. One of the stranger curiosities in Machiavelli's story is his relationship with love and personal intrigue. He married Marietta Cassini in 1502, and while they had several children together. Letters hint at flirtations outside the marriage, sometimes in jest, sometimes as rumor. Whether these affairs were real or exaggerated, they fit the portrait of a man neither puritanical nor uninterested in passion. Some scholars even note the sensual undercurrents in his descriptions of fortuna and power, though these may be as much rhetorical flourish as personal confession. Contrary to his enduring reputation for cynicism, Machiavelli could be, in private moments, surprisingly idealistic, or at least nostalgic, for republican virtue. In the discourses, his admiration for Rome's citizen soldiers and civic spirit borders on romantic. He lamented corruption and moral decay as enemies to liberty, even while acknowledging that such decay was almost inevitable. In personal friendships, he valued loyalty, candid exchange, and mutual respect, and was wounded when doubted or discarded by allies. We might also be surprised to discover that Machiavelli was something of a poet. Beyond plays, he composed verse, sometimes satirical, sometimes lyrical. These poems were not widely published in his lifetime, often circulating among friends, but they add a layer of sensitivity and artistry to his image. In them, we find reflections on aging, the whims of fate, and the folly of men, as much personal confession as political allegory. He could poke fun at himself in these writings. One piece, written as a mock epitaph. Riley imagined visitors to his grave wondering whether he had been honest or deceitful, and concluding that in death, at least, he could no longer plot. Such self-directed humor suggests a man aware of his polarizing reputation, even in his own time, and content to play with it. Machiavelli's curiosity extended beyond politics and literature into military engineering and geography. He sketched plans for fortifications and held an interest in how terrain could determine the outcome of battles. His art of war is both a technical manual and a philosophical meditation on readiness. And in discussions with contemporaries, he would even speculate about adapting ancient battle formations to contemporary conditions, an intellectual exercise as much as a practical plan. There are also lesser-known instances of Machiavelli offering pragmatic, almost folksy, advice to ordinary Florentines. Friends and acquaintances sought him out for counsel not only on political matters, but on business disputes, will-making, even marital issues, and he often responded with a blend of serious reasoning and humorous anecdote. These exchanges may have kept his rhetorical skills sharp even in political exile. Among the more poignant moments is the story that, after his death, he was initially buried without fanfare. It was only later that a grander monument was erected in Santa Croce, with the inscription, "Tanto nomini nullum par elogium," no eulogy is equal to so great a name. This posthumous honor contrasts with the relatively modest, even lonely, circumstances of his final years. He had lived just long enough to see the Medici expelled again, but not long enough to be restored to the center of the political stage that had always animated him. One can imagine, and some contemporaries did, that Machiavelli would have relished the chance to influence Florence's Republican revival in 1527, to test his theories against unfolding events. That this chance never came only adds to the bittersweet edge of his life story. The man who wrote so perceptively about seizing fortune as forelock missed. In the end, the one turn of fortune that might have reunited his with public purpose. And yet, even removed from the levers of power, Machiavelli found ways to participate in the life of his city through his pen. His histories of Florence, commissioned by the Medici, were careful enough not to provoke their patrons, but shrewd enough to embed lessons about factionalism and civic health. His comedies brought Florentine audiences laughter, while also encouraging them to recognize human folly in all its political and personal forms. For those seeking inspiration beyond his political maxims, this more intimate Machiavelli offers much: the resilience to keep working despite disgrace, the ability to blend seriousness with humor, the commitment to keep learning from history even when one cannot directly shape it, the courage to speak plainly about unpleasant truths, and the enjoyment of life's small pleasures amid adversity. In a way, this is as much his legacy as the Prince, the example of a man who, stripped of office and tortured by his enemies, still found energy to write works that would outlast kingdoms. That endurance, fueled by curiosity, wit, and an unbroken engagement with the human condition, is something any generation can admire, even if they never sit on a throne or command an army. The story of Machiavelli is not one that ends neatly in his death in June of 1527, his passing in a Florence briefly restored to Republican. Rule marked the close of a life defined by sharp turns of fortune, yet his influence only began to grow in the centuries after. Machiavelli lives on less in the particulars of Florentine diplomacy and more in the enduring language of power, the interplay of courage and caution, reality and appearance, morality and necessity. His name itself became a signifier, at times a slur, at times a compliment, for a style of leadership that refuses illusions and accepts the world's rough edges. When we look at his life as a whole, we see a man bound by deep contradictions that were never fully resolved, and perhaps could never be. He was a Republican who wrote one of history's most famous manuals for princes. He was a lover of liberty who accepted that cruelty and deception might sometimes be the tools needed to save it. He admired ancient virtue, but lived through an era in which survival often required quick betrayals. He valued laughter and play, yet devoted his best hours to sober reflection on the deadly stakes of politics. This tension is one reason Machiavelli endures. He did not claim that the world should always operate on the hard principles he articulated, only that it often does. In that sense, he was less an architect of ruthlessness than its cartographer. By mapping the terrain of power as it is, without adornment, he gave future generations a clearer view of the actual forces that govern political life. Whether one accepts or rejects his prescriptions, one cannot easily dismiss his diagnosis. His own experience embodied the very concepts he described, was visible when he navigated delicate embassies to France, to the Pope, to Cesare Borgia, and returned with usable intelligence for the Florentine Republic. His understanding of Fortuna was tested when the Medici swept back into power and, without warning, destroyed his career. If anyone knew how rapidly fortune's wheel could turn, it was Machiavelli, one day guiding the city's defenses, the next hanging by his bound wrists in a prison, accused of treachery. The fact that he used exile not for bitterness but for creation is also telling. From that enforced solitude came the prince, the discourses on Livy, the art of war, the mandrake, and his Florentine histories, a body of thought that would outlive nearly every political arrangement of his day. In this choice, to turn personal loss into an opportunity for intellectual production, lies a kind of personal philosophy that agency survives even when formal power does not. Part of why Machiavelli inspires, even if his advice shocks, is that he took responsibility for seeing clearly. He rejected the comfort of pretending that goodness alone was enough to secure the state. He understood that lofty ideals, unprotected by strategy and force, can be quickly destroyed by less scrupulous actors. And yet, his willingness to discuss deception or cruelty was always linked to an overarching goal: the preservation of political order, the defense of the community from anarchy and foreign domination. The challenge he offers us is a deep one. What do we do when the demands of morality conflict with the requirements of survival? Do we cling to principle even if it means allowing greater harm? Or do we sometimes allow means we find distasteful in service of ends we deem necessary? Machiavelli did not pretend such questions had easy answers. He offered his judgment, grounded in the turbulence of his age, but he also left the discomfort intact. His legacy is not only in the content of his advice, but in his method, the insistence on starting from reality as it is observed, rather than from imagined ideals. This empirical instinct made him a forerunner of modern political science. It also made him a kind of universal mirror, leaders as different as Napoleon. Gandhi, Mandela, and corporate CEOs can find in him principles that speak to their own situations, even if they interpret them in vastly different moral keys. There are personal qualities in Machiavelli's life that extend beyond politics. His resilience shines in the years after his fall, continuing to write, to correspond, to develop ideas when others might have retreated into obscurity. His wit reminds us that even in sober matters, humor can be a political and human asset. His engagement with history models a habit every leader can adopt. Actively conversing with the past to better navigate the present. The inspiration one might draw from him is not in adopting cynicism as a worldview, but in embracing alertness, adaptability, and strategic self-knowledge. Machiavelli teaches the value of preparing for reversals, of understanding one's strengths and weaknesses, of cultivating skills before the hour of need. His lion and fox metaphor works as well for personal careers as for princely courts. It is dangerous to be only strong or only clever. One must be both. At the same time, Machiavelli's life cautions against the illusion of perfect control. Fortuna will turn no matter how great one's. His story is a reminder to act decisively when opportunity presents itself, for it may not return. That he died just as Florence reopened the Republican doors he had always favored is a poignant lesson in the limits of human agency. The man was also a participant in the Renaissance humanist tradition, though often cast as its dark twin. Even in his grimmest analysis, his works are studded with examples from Roman and Greek history, showing his belief that the experience of humanity is a continuous thread, that lessons can cross centuries if read with discernment. Beneath the pragmatism lies the conviction that history is a teacher, but only for those willing to study it without sentimentality. In modern times, we can see Machiavelli as a touchstone for thinking about leadership under pressure. His perspective is especially relevant in periods of crisis, disruption, or conflict, when nice theories crash into the wall of reality. In times of peace and abundance, some of his counsel may feel excessive. In times of existential danger, it can seem like the only language that makes sense. That duality explains why he is alternately reviled and revered, often by the same people at different moments. Machiavelli's legend, then, is more than just the pages of The Prince. It is the story of a man who lived through the whirlwinds of his own theory, who rose and fell with the shifting balance of and fortuna, who knew both the engine room of power and the loneliness of exile, who could blend a playwright's humor with a soldier's realism, who could love his city fiercely, even as he told it hard truths it did not always want to hear. He remains relevant because the structure of human ambition and fear that he described has not changed. The same interplay of trust and suspicion, of appearance and reality, of strategy and improvisation still defines leadership in politics, business, and community life. Whether we embrace him as a guide or reject him as too severe, we are still answering questions he posed 5 centuries ago. His final lesson may be this: do not look away. Do not let idealism blind you to reality, nor let reality strip you of ideals. Strong states, strong communities, and strong individuals are those who can endure that tension without collapsing into naivety on one side or despair on the other. And so, Machiavelli's figure endures, sometimes looming ominously, sometimes standing as a wry companion with a half-smile and a sharp observation. His is not the easy comfort of the dreamer, but the bracing counsel of someone who has been burned by politics and yet returned to its study with undiminished fascination. He invites us into that same fascination if we have the courage to see the world as it is and to ask ourselves how much we possess to meet whatever fortuna delivers.